guys, welcome to my back porch once again. So it looks like we're going to be putting out some more videos through the month of May, and so my game plan for those videos is kind of to dive into different groups of animals and kind of get a little bit more in depth on what makes those groups of animals unique compared to other ones. And so I'm looking forward to doing a video hopefully on marine mammals, marine reptiles, maybe one on sharks, and maybe cover some bony fishes as well. But kind of what I wanted to cover before we dive into those videos is sort of the classification of animals in general, and like how we kind of define what one group of animal is versus another. And so I kind of wanted to cover taxonomy and how we decide what an animal is called and what group of animals it's related to. So when we talk about an animal's taxonomy, we usually break it down into a couple different groups, and so as those groups get lower and lower down the chain here, it's going to be more and more specific, right? So the first group is what we call a domain. So I'm going to write them all down just so we can go ahead and cover them and you can kind of follow along with me. So going down the list, we have a couple different rankings. So the most broad is domain, then we have kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, and species. So that would be kind of how our taxonomy of our animals is going to be broken down. So like I said, this might be backwards for you guys, but you're going to start off with domain being the most broad category, and then you're going to kind of get more and more specific once you go down to the bottom. And when we are using scientific names for our animals, we name them using a system called binomial nomenclature. So I'm going to write that down to you real quick. Alright. So like I said, that's called binomial nomenclature. And so this is a two-name system that we use to give our animals their scientific names. And so if you break down this word right here, so it's bi, meaning two, nomial, name, and then nomenclature has to do with the naming of something or the title or the way it's referred to, right? So binomial nomenclature is a two-name system, and so the two names come from their genus and their species. So genus comes first, and then species follows. And so when you write it, you always capitalize the genus and you have the species lowercase. And when you're writing it by hand, you're going to underline it. But if you were to type it, you would have to italicize it. So that's the proper format to write binomial nomenclature in. But like I said, so those are going to be the scientific names of all of our animals. Usually they are Latin names or Latin words. And so if you are familiar with some of those words, some of those names make a little bit more sense, but for the most part a lot of these names are going to be pretty complicated and not very familiar to us, so when we hear them we don't exactly know what they're talking about. One of my favorite ones, which I will be covering in a later video, is Tursiops truncatus. So if I were to say that to you, you might not know what that is, right? So Tursiops truncatus, I'll write it down on the video so you guys can kind of see how it's spelled. But that's actually a bottlenose dolphin. Yeah, so we know what those guys are. But the reason that we are going to use such a complicated name for it instead of just saying dolphin is because using our binomial nomenclature, our scientific names, helps us to communicate with other places and other groups of people in a way that's more unified. So everybody's going to know what Tursiops truncatus is, whereas here we might call it a bottlenose dolphin, maybe somewhere else it might be called the gray dolphin, you know, so colloquially we use different names for local animals, but when we're talking about scientific papers and scientific research, it's really important that everyone knows exactly what I'm talking about when I'm talking about that animal. So there's no confusion, we typically don't use common names. So I wouldn't call it a bottlenose dolphin in a scientific research paper. I would need to call it by its scientific name, Tursiops truncatus. So like I said, if you are familiar with some of those Latin names, some of those scientific names make a little bit more sense. So truncatus has to do with its nose, talking about the shape of it. So it makes a little more sense if you know what the Latin words mean, but most people don't. I don't always know either, but a lot of scientific names can also be kind of made up by the people who discover the animals. So the California sea lion, its name is Elaphus californianus. So the Californianus, this comes from the California sea lion. So for the most part, it's Latin names, but we also can kind of play around with it a little bit too if you are the person that discovers that animal or decides to define it as its own species. You can kind of be in charge of naming it. All right, so when we talk about domains, like I said, it's a really broad category of characterization. So we used to call them, you could either be a eukaryote or a prokaryote, but we have actually divided prokaryotes down further into you can be either bacteria or archaea. Those are really kind of niche categories, nothing that we really talk about, or I'm going to talk about, but for us, the main one we're going to cover is eukarya. So that's going to contain all of our plants and animals and stuff like that. Archaea is going to contain organisms that are usually more found in very extreme environments, places like, you know, subthermal vents and stuff like that. You usually don't just find them like around in your daily life. And then bacteria, obviously, that's going to be really small cellular level kind of thing. So not really your megafauna that I'm going to be discussing. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to kind of break down our classification as human beings so that you guys can kind of get an introduction to how to an example of the taxonomy of something that you're familiar with, which is yourself. So like I said, in domain, since there's not very many, a lot of things fall under the same domain as us. So like I said, we're going to be in the domain Eukaryota. Alright, so domain Eukaryota. That's really poorly written, but maybe I'll add it into the video too so you can see it. And then for our kingdom, we're going to be in kingdom Animalia. So that might be pretty familiar to you guys. You guys have heard the term the animal kingdom, right? Some other really common kingdoms are Plantae, so that's going to be most of your plants. We also have Protista, which has a lot of our really small organisms. We have Fungi, which is another one that's really similar to plants, and it used to be considered in the same kingdom as plants until we did further research and decided that it's its own kingdom altogether. So that's something about this taxonomy stuff that is kind of interesting, is that it's always changing. So as we kind of discover more characteristics of organisms and more things that make organisms unique, we can kind of have to reevaluate what we decide falls under one category, right? So what makes something unique to something else kind of thing, right? And so something that's always in flux is kind of science in general, but especially things like taxonomy. So we can kind of change what we think is related to one another and change where we think things come from and what falls under what category. That's something that changes a lot. We've got plants and animals and fungi and stuff like that all falling under different kingdoms, right? And then next for us, so like I said, we have domain, Eukarya, kingdom Animalia, and our phylum is going to be Chordata. So Chordata there is mostly in reference to our spinal cord. So animals with a spine and that kind of body arrangement are gonna be chordates. Then our next classification is class. And so for us, our class is Mammalia. So like I said, I plan on doing a video later about marine mammals, so I'm gonna kind of cover this class again, but that's the same class that we fall under as well, right? So we're mammals, and there are marine mammals as well, so I'm really excited to talk about those, but we know us as human beings are also considered mammals. So then next is order, and we have primates. And so our order is primate, right? So we are most closely related to primates, and so that falls under, so we fall under that same order as some of those gorillas and things like that, right? All right, and then for our family, we have Hominidae. So that's our family that we fall under. And then, like I said, when we get to genus, species, that's gonna be what determines our scientific name, right? So our genus is Homo, and our species is Sapien. So we as human beings are Homo sapiens, right? And so you guys might have heard that term before. That's how we got that name, right? So that's our genus and our species, Homo sapiens. And so that's the classification or the taxonomy of a human being, but you can do that for all animals, and that's a good way to kind of see how things are all related, right? So if we were to compare ourselves to dolphins, we would be exactly the same up until this point. And then from class, we both be in class Mammalia, but then after that, when we get to order, they're going to be in a different order than we are. So that's kind of where we branch off, and so we can kind of decide how closely related we are to things, to other species, based on how far up the hierarchy that branching off happens. So that, like I said, is called taxonomy, and that is our binomial nomenclature. So like I was kind of mentioning, the reason we use our scientific names is they're pretty universal, so that people in other places know what we're talking about when we say our scientific names. So using common names can be really tricky because there's all kinds of animals that are named the same thing, but they're different animals in different places. Like we know the Virginia opossum and the Australian possum are two completely different animals. If you wanted to look those up, you can. So if you said possum in Australia versus possum here in the US, they're completely different. There's also up in the mountains, they have something called a mountain chicken, which is actually a frog. So if you were to say, oh, that's a mountain chicken, you wouldn't think it's a frog, but it is. So that's one of the reasons we don't really use we don't use common names when we talk about animals in the research route, but sometimes they are kind of easier when we're talking to just people locally or casually. So if you were to say something like Orcinius orca, you might not know what that is, but then you could say killer whale, and everyone kind of knows what that is, right? And so when you're talking to just someone casually, it can be kind of easier to use our common names, and also it can help us to identify things that are related to each other. So for a lot of things like shark species, like if we say a mako shark, a tiger shark, a great white shark, you know those are all sharks. You know what sharks are, you know what they look like, you can kind of tell they're all related. But if I gave you the scientific names for each of those, you might not know that I'm talking about all the same group. So using common names can be beneficial because it can be simpler, but they're not always as reliable. So it's important to also know your scientific names. So one of the tools we can use out in the field to help us identify different species that we might not be familiar with is something called a dichotomous key. And so our dichotomous key is something that helps us to identify a species or an organism based on its characteristics. So basically, the way that it works is it's kind of like a list, and you're going to either go this way or that way with it, right? So it's going to ask you a couple questions about the organism that you have in question, and it's going to kind of lead you to more and more specific questions to get you to identify that organism that you're unsure about, right? So that's one of the activities that we do at the Science Center, is we have a dichotomous key exercise that we do with seashells, because I showed you guys all the shells that we have at the center, so that's one of those really fun hands-on ways that you can go about identifying them. So on a dichotomous key, it might ask you something like, is the shell opaque or is it shiny? So if you had your two shells here and you're trying to tell what's what, so this would be an example of a shiny shell here, and this would be an opaque one. So if you had this shell and you're wondering what it is, that first question would be like, okay, is it shiny? Go to question 2. Or is it opaque? Go to question 5. And then from there, it'll ask you further and further questions. So another one, it might ask you, it could say, is it left-handed or is it right-handed? So remember I said right-handed, your right hand fits into it nicely. Left-handed, your left hand would fit into it nicely. So that could be another thing to kind of set your desertions apart to identify your shells. And then some shells are all pretty closely related, but you're trying to figure out which one it is specifically. So all these come from scallops. And so it might ask, does your shell have protrusions? And so if you had this one, you would say no, it does not have protrusions, and you'd go to number 3. And then if it did have protrusions, you could say, okay, now I'm going to go to number 4. And then from number 4, it might ask you, are those protrusions long and pointy, or are they rounded and large? And so then you'd say, okay, they're rounded and large. This is a lion's paw scallop. Or you can say there are long protrusions that are a little spiky, and then you'd go to question 7. And so that's kind of one of the tools we use out in the field to help us identify all kinds of animals, right? So that's something, if you're interested, once we open back up, to check it out. Dichotomous keys can be pretty fun, especially when you're talking about seashells. All right, so that's kind of an introduction to how we classify animals. So then hopefully moving forward, I'm going to kind of dive into these different classes, different orders, different genuses and species, and kind of talk about them a little bit more in depth. But this way, when I'm kind of introducing a group, you kind of know where we are in the hierarchy of life there. So hopefully this will lead into our next videos nicely, and so hopefully you guys can check out those videos when I post them. But until then, stay quarantined, stay healthy, stay safe, and be nice to each other. Bye.